Y estamos en vivo desde la costa este. Vamos a revisar cuál ha sido la subida de tasas de interés de 0,75, cómo ha reaccionado el mercado. Básicamente tenemos que esperar la conferencia de Jerome Powell porque esto es bastante importante en la bolsa de valores. Hay que tener bastante cuidado el día de hoy, especialmente con las palabras de Jerome Powell, por favor. No nos empecemos a desesperar. Denme 2 segundos, por favor. Vamos a empezar el directo de una manera diferente, por el hecho de efectivamente que tenemos este nuevo formato de cómo podemos tenerlo el directo de esta manera, ¿sí? Vamos a ver básicamente cómo está el tema de Jerome Powell, vamos a ver cómo está el tema de la Reserva Federal y vamos a ver cómo reaccionan los mercados el día de hoy ante esta situación. ¿Les parece? Denme 2 segundos, vamos a empezar aquí con el directo. Básicamente estamos aquí, perfecto. Esto lo vamos a poner acá. Listo, la tasa de interés de la Fed sube aproximadamente 0,75% porcentuales por segunda vez consecutiva para combatir la inflación. Vamos a leer qué es lo que ha pasado el día de hoy. La Fed sube las tasas de interés en 0,75 puntos porcentuales por segunda vez consecutiva para combatir la inflación. La Reserva Federal promulgó el miércoles su segundo aumento consecutivo de la tasa de interés de 0,75 puntos porcentuales, ya que busca contener la inflación galopante sin crear una recesión, al llevar la tasa de referencia de los préstamos hasta un rango de 2.25 a 2.5%. Veremos cómo está reaccionando el mercado, ¿les parece? El Nasdaq está prácticamente 2.5% arriba, el S&P 1.35%, todas las acciones están subiendo. PayPal con más razón porque ha reportado interesantes expectativas trimestrales, 10% arriba, y también a un inversor muy famoso ha empezado a invertir en PayPal. Así en Face, vamos a ver cómo está la situación, 16% arriba en Face. Spotify, cómo le está yendo, 11% arriba. Básicamente todo está subiendo el día de hoy, afortunadamente. Hay que esperar el pronunciamiento de Jerome Powell, 6.8% para Google, increíble cómo está Meta Platforms actualmente. Quiero revisarla. Bastante fuerte este tema. Quiero ver cómo están las acciones con esta subida de tasa de interés. Si bien la tasa de fondos federales afecta más directamente lo que los bancos se cobran entre sí por los préstamos a corto plazo, se alimenta de una multitud de productos de consumo como hipotecas ajustables, préstamos para automóviles y tarjetas de crédito. El aumento lleva la tasa de fondos a su nivel más alto desde aproximadamente diciembre de 2018 a 2.25 y 2.5. Si los mercados esperaban en gran medida este movimiento de la Fed, era lo esperado de 0.75 aproximadamente. En su declaración posterior a la reunión, el Comité Federal de Mercado Abierto que fija las tasas advirtió que los indicadores recientes de gasto y producción se han suavizado. Así, hay que revisar cómo está la situación también acá. Hay que actualizar esto porque se nos viene ya Jerome Powell. Denme un segundo, con la musiquita la vamos a bajar. Se nos viene Jerome Powell y hay que estar atentos. 2:30, en aproximadamente unos 10 minutos va a empezar a hablar Jerome Powell. Así que hay que estar atentos a eso. Quiero ver cómo está la situación. Esto es lo que cambió en la nueva declaración de la Fed. Vamos a investigarlo ahora. Sin embargo, dice que la creación de empleo ha sido sólido en los últimos meses y la tasa de desempleo se ha mantenido baja. Agregó el comité utilizando un lenguaje similar a la de la declaración de junio. Los funcionarios nuevamente describieron la inflación como elevada y atribuyeron la situación a problemas de cadena de suministros y precios más altos de alimentos y energía junto con las presiones de precios más amplias. Así, por favor, confírmeme si se escucha correctamente el directo. Estamos aquí viendo la situación de la Fed. Confírmeme, por favor, si se escucha correctamente el directo, si se escucha bien el audio y todo. Dice que la subida de tipos fue aprobada por unanimidad en junio. La presidenta de la Fed de Kansas City, Esther George, disintió y abogó por un curso más lento con un aumento de medio punto porcentual. Los aumentos se producen a un año de que comenzó las tasas flotando alrededor de cero, pero que ha visto una medida de inflación comúnmente citada que se ubica en 9.1% anual. La Reserva Federal tiene como objetivo una inflación alrededor del 2%, aunque ajustó ese objetivo en 2020. En junio la tasa de desempleo, atención, se mantuvo en 3.6%, cerca del pleno empleo. Sí, vamos a ver cómo está la situación de la bolsa. Bueno, todo está subiendo. Soetis prácticamente lateral porque ya ha caído ese mercado, ha cerrado, perdón. JD, Alibaba y Tencent han bajado porque son acciones. Visa está cayendo 2.78% de manera extraña. Sí, podríamos analizarla en un momento. Amazon subiendo 3%, Apple casi 2%, Tesla 4%, Alphabet 6.6%, Meta 5%, Microsoft 5%, el Nasdaq subiendo 2.25%, Nvidia subiendo 5%, en PayPal subiendo 10%, por cierto, Nintendo prácticamente lateral, el Nasdaq 100 LTF subiendo a 2.22%, ya ha roto seguramente tendencia bajista, el ETF de Brasil subiendo 1.27%. Los ETFs, ¿cómo les va? Bueno, los ETFs del gas natural cayendo, de el maíz también, la economía de México también. Básicamente eso es todo. El ETF de bienes raíces también un poco. Después todo absolutamente está en positivo. El oro subiendo 0.4%, la plata 0.9% actualmente. Bastante interesante en esta época invertir en plata. La verdad es que me parece bastante inteligente. En estos momentos, Colgate va a reportar números el día viernes, prácticamente lateral. ¿Cómo le está yendo a las acciones de Coca-Cola? Cayendo. Vamos a revisarla si está a buen precio. Ya va a empezar el reporte de Jerome Powell, lo vamos a escuchar en vivo. El tema de McDonald's también lateral, todo está lateral. Walmart subiendo 2.5% después de las caídas del otro día. Vamos a revisarlas rápidamente. ¿Cómo está el tema de Walmart? ¿Cómo está el tema también de... Bueno, como te diste cuenta, ha tenido un gap súper bajista cuando estaba tocando su techo, su anterior suelo, que ahora es techo, en 133 y cayó aproximadamente a 120. Bastante complicado el tema de Walmart, pero se está recuperando muy bien. Te da reentrada, has dado 3 oportunidades de poder tenerla a menos de 120. Espero lo hayas aprovechado. Walmart es una de esas que ha sobrevivido a la crisis del 2000, del 2008, así que no creo que tenga mucho problema para sobrevivir esta. Coca-Cola también un poco más de lo mismo, ha caído, ha bajado en estos días. Yo quisiera comprarla por debajo de 60 o cerca de 60, está en un precio bastante interesante. Estoy siendo muy tentado por comprar esta empresa, también McDonald's, que ya la tengo en mi portafolio de hecho. En eso estoy muy contento, está rebotando como te puedes dar cuenta. Tendencia bajista en 1, 2, 3 puntos, lo rompió, hizo un suelo ahí, doble suelo y está queriendo ahora subir el tema de McDonald's. Bastante interesante para poder refugiar nuestro efectivo ahí, ¿sí? El tema de Restaurant Brands también subiendo en 1.3%, que es básicamente Burger King, Popeyes, cadenas de restaurantes. El Bitcoin subiendo, Ethereum también, ya está en 1500 otra vez, 12% Ethereum, bastante volátil esta criptomoneda. En las acciones de alto riesgo, bueno, Lucid prácticamente lateral. Virgin Galactic, ¿cuál es la que más está subiendo? Actualmente está subiendo más Roku. Recuerda que van a reportar resultados finalizando este día en aproximadamente unas 2 horas. Y el tema también de Palantir, que está bastante interesante. BlockFi, Lemonade, muy interesante. AT&T también por el tema de dividendos. Y eso es lo que tenemos en la bolsa de valores. ¿Cuáles son los trending tickets del día de hoy? Teva aproximadamente 23%, de farmacéuticas, ahí te das cuenta de la especulación que está teniendo el mercado actualmente. El tema de Enphase subiendo también un 16%, no tan especulativa como la otra de Teva, pero bastante interesante. Snap, ¿cuánto está subiendo? Snapchat con las subidas de las FANG, a ver, desastre total, no puede subir Snap, lamentablemente está un desastre desde 74 hasta 9. A esto me refiero con acciones un poco especulativas en este tipo de épocas que no son una buena idea. Hay que tener bastante cuidado en este sentido, por favor. Sí, el reporte de la Fed ya van a estar en vivo, por el amor del Señor Dios. Ya casi, estamos en vivo. No a esto, por favor, vamos a ocultar el chat. Emitir prueba, estamos en vivo. Aquí estamos, perfecto. Aquí lo vamos a silenciar y aquí lo vamos a poner un poco de volumen. Ya va a empezar a hablar Jerome Powell. Básicamente el mercado está, por no decirte complicado, subiendo, volátil. Ojalá Jerome Powell hable muy bien o cuide muy bien sus palabras en el sentido de no alertar a la población. Así, me van a avisar por favor en breve si el audio se escucha bien. Todavía no estamos con el tema de Jerome Powell, que falta por entrar, ¿sí? Estamos así en la situación del día de hoy. Entiendo, dice que... Dame un segundo. Perfecto. Es una nueva modalidad que tengo aquí. Vamos a ver cómo resulta esto acá. Esto lo vamos a poner aquí y vamos a poner el chat en vivo un poco más arriba. Denme un segundo, por favor. Vamos a ponerlo de manera correcta. Sí, ya va a hablar Jerome Powell. Atención a eso. Ténganme un poco de paciencia. 250 aproximadamente. Si lo ponemos el alto en aproximadamente 350, ¿qué pasará? Y ya se me fue esto. Quiero el chat en vivo aquí, por el amor del Señor Dios. 200 aproximadamente. A ver. No. De hecho no. 200 chat en vivo. Déjenme probar. Estoy probando una cuestión nueva en el chat. 2900 aproximadamente aquí. Y vamos a tener a Jerome Powell, que todavía no sale. Todavía no sale. Estamos aproximadamente a un par de segundos de poder ver cómo está Jerome Powell. Gracias, Ernesto. Muy buena presentación, pero entiendo que el mercado ya interiorizó esta subida de tasas. Sí, efectivamente ya está un poco más digerido, por así decirlo. Así que hay que tener cuidado, pero no pánico en este sentido. Sí, hay que tener cuidado, pero no pánico en este tipo de movidas de la Fed. Todavía no habla Jerome Powell. Vamos a revisar un poco más acerca, es que no quiero perderme ese tema. Invertir en este momento en acciones especulativas, la verdad es que me parece una locura. Está demasiado volátil todo. Te puedes beneficiar en el tema de Ethereum, sí, pero hay que tener bastante cuidado, por favor, en ese sentido. En Ethereum, en Bitcoin, tener 5% de tu portafolio en acciones o criptomonedas, en este caso especulativas, me parece que está bien. Puedes, en una semana subió aproximadamente Ethereum un 50% aproximadamente. Te puedes fijar de 1000 a 1500, de hecho casi 1600 aproximadamente en ese lapso. Me parece bastante interesante el hecho de tener ese tipo de revalorizaciones, pero tratar de seguir ese ritmo de tener semanalmente 50% me parece algo irreal. Entonces deberíamos tener un poco más de criterio al invertir. Sí, tenemos que tener bastante cuidado en ese aspecto y por favor tener mucha precaución en este caso. Denme 2 segundos, por favor. Ya va a empezar a hablar Jerome Powell en aproximadamente 2 minutos. Estamos aquí tratando de que esto se nos salga aquí en vivo. Muy buenos. Aquí estamos, perfecto. Ya estamos casi listos con este tema. En 500, si lo ponemos aquí, vamos a intentar que esto sea más pequeño, pero ya va a hablar Jerome Powell. Other slides, microphones, please identify yourself, para unas preguntas a Jerome Powell, ¿sí? Hay que tener en cuenta eso. Esto era lo que quería. Desde hoy vamos a tener las preguntas en vivo, de hecho. Vamos a tener el chat en vivo en la pantalla también. Es algo que estoy implementándolo. Todavía estoy con prueba y error. Por favor, un poco de paciencia en ese sentido. Se los pediría. Estamos básicamente aquí. Perfecto. Ya va a hablar Jerome Powell. Ya estamos en vivo todavía, por el amor del Señor Dios. Estamos esperando a que empiece a hablar Jerome Powell y estoy tratando de poner este nuevo implemento de el chat en vivo para que aparezca en pantalla. Denme 2 segundos. Vamos a ver si aparece ahora sí. No. De hecho, no. A ver. Aquí estamos. ¿Cómo estás, Emuldes? ¿Crees que sí suban el punto porcentual? Ya subieron 0,75, de hecho. Ahora solo falta que hable Jerome Powell, pero eso es lo más preocupante de la situación, ¿sí? Ahora sí me aparecen todas estas cosas. Ahí está, perfecto. Ernesto Fairly. Muy buena presentación, pero entiendo que el mercado ya interiorizó esta subida de tasas. Sí, de hecho, ya está bastante tranquilo el mercado, de hecho alcista en ese sentido. Así que hay que tener bastante cuidado en ese aspecto, por favor. Get over URL. Ahora la pregunta es cómo quito esta pregunta. Querido Ernesto, estamos tratando de mejorar también el en vivo y el chat. Así que, y ahí lo ponemos a mouse también. Y venimos aquí a ocultar, añadir. Y listo, chat de destacado, chat en directo, perfecto. Y ahí lo vamos a dejar. Sí, de hecho, no hay ningún problema que se queden ahí. Sí. Todavía no habrá Jerome Powell. Lo que quiero ver es si se queda aquí la pregunta. No, no se queda. Perfecto. Perfecto, gracias por tener un poco de paciencia en ese sentido. Estamos haciendo prueba y error. Bueno, el mercado está asumiendo, está totalmente lateral el mercado seguramente hace un par de minutos por el hecho de que va a hablar Jerome Powell. El tema de Visa está cayendo bastante, 2.53%, debido a la subida de tasas tal vez. Vamos a investigarlo en un momento. Por favor, hay que estar atentos a Jerome Powell. Básicamente 0.75, como hemos visto. Aquí está. Podemos actualizar esto de la 0.75 de subidas. 1% estaban esperando. Fed subió 0.75. 5 cosas que serán más caras. Bastante fuerte este artículo. A ver. No quiero perder a Jerome Powell, por el amor del Señor Dios. También quiero ponerlo en vivo en 2.30, que todavía no está en vivo, de la Reserva Federal. Estamos en vivo con Yahoo Finance, también con la Reserva Federal, la página web. Así que estamos en vivo esperando lo que nos se dice, ¿sí? Es importante también revisar eso. Tarjetas de crédito. Aquí está. Con la Reserva Federal aumentando las tasas de interés, es probable que la tasa de porcentaje anual de su tarjeta de crédito aumente en un par de ciclos de facturación. Eso significa que pagará más por cualquier deuda de tarjeta de crédito pendiente que no esté pagada a fin de mes. Un aumento de tasa de 2.25 en lo que va del año significa que para un titular de tarjeta que realiza el pago mínimo de un saldo de tarjeta de crédito de $5,000 necesitará 5 meses adicionales y $868 en interés para pagar la tarjeta por completo, según los cálculos proporcionados por Bankrate. Atención, es algo bastante importante que tengamos en cuenta. Sí, por el amor de Dios, Jerome Powell, entra de una vez. Aquí estamos, perfecto. Perfecto. Aquí estamos. Atención.
Good afternoon.
Confírame si se escucha correctamente, por favor.
My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so. We have both the tools we need and the resolve it will take to restore price stability on behalf of
Están
American
esperando que la
families and
inflación sea
businesses.
controlada en esta época.
The economy and the country have been through a lot over the past 2.5 years and have proved resilient. It is essential that we bring inflation down to our 2% goal if we are to have a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. From the standpoint of our congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability, the current picture is plain to see. The labor market is extremely tight, and inflation is much too high. Against this backdrop, today the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by 0.75 percentage point and anticipates that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate.
Está apropiadamente, dice que está
In addition,
justificando la
we
subida
are
de
continuing the
0.75.
process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. And I'll have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators of spending and production have softened. Growth in consumer spending has slowed significantly, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened, in part reflecting higher mortgage rates. And after a strong increase in the first quarter, business fixed investment also looks to have declined in the second quarter. Despite these developments, the labor market has remained extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a 50-year low, job vacancies near historical highs, and wage growth elevated. Over the past 3 months, employment rose by an average of 375,000 jobs per month, down from the average pace seen earlier in the year, but still robust. Improvements in labor market conditions have been widespread, including for workers at the lower end of the wage distribution, as well as for African Americans and Hispanics. Labor demand is very strong, while labor supply remains subdued, with the labor force participation rate little changed since January. Overall, the continued strength of the labor market suggests that underlying aggregate demand remains solid. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%.
Quiero que lo vean de esta manera.
Over the 12 months ending in May, Total PCE prices rose 6.3%, excluding the volatile food and energy categories. Labor demand is very strong, while labor supply remains subdued, with the labor force participation rate little changed since January. Overall, the continued strength of the labor market suggests that underlying aggregate demand remains solid. Inflation remains well above our longer run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in
Esperando
May,
que sea de 2%.
total PCE prices rose
La inflación en
6.3%,
12 meses.
excluding the volatile food and energy categories. Core PCE prices rose 7%.
Oh shit, perdón.
Expectations at 9.1%, and the change in the core CPI was 5.9%. Notwithstanding the recent slowdown in overall economic activity, aggregate demand appears to remain strong. Supply constraints have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, and price pressures are evident across a broad range of goods and services. Although prices for some commodities have turned down recently, the earlier surge in prices of crude oil and other commodities that resulted from Russia's war on Ukraine has boosted prices for gasoline and food, creating additional upward pressure on inflation.
Sigue culpando a Rusia, obviamente, y a Ucrania por el precio de la gasolina, el petróleo y todo.
Maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation.
Transporte, casa,
We are highly
está
attentive
bastante
to the risks
complicada.
high
Espera
inflation
que ahí
poses to both
esté
sides of our mandate.
lo más complicado de
We're
la
strongly
situación
committed to
de la
returning
inflación.
inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 0.75 of a percentage point, bringing the target range to 2.25 to 2.5%.
0.75,
And we're
sí,
continuing
subió.
the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet, which plays an important role in firming the stance of monetary policy. Over coming months, we will be looking for compelling evidence that inflation is moving down, consistent with inflation returning to 2%.
Estamos esperando que
We
en los siguientes
anticipate
meses
that
la
ongoing
inflación
increases in
baje
the target range
para
for the federal
nuestra
funds rate will
nuestra
be
expectativa de
appropriate.
2%, ojalá.
The pace of those increases will continue to depend on the incoming data and evolving outlook for the economy. Today's increase is in the target range is the second 75 basis point increase in as many meetings. While another unusually large increase could be appropriate at our next meeting, that is a decision that will depend on the data we get between now and then.
Vamos a ver las estadísticas y depende
We
de
will
eso si
continue to
subimos
make our
aún más las
decisions
tasas de
meeting by
interés en la
meeting
próxima reunión.
and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. As the stance of monetary policy tightens further, it likely will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring demand into better balance with supply in order to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored.
A repetir
Making
lo mismo.
appropriate monetary policy in this uncertain environment requires a recognition that the economy often evolves in unexpected ways. Inflation has obviously surprised to the upside over the past year, and further surprises could be in store. We therefore will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. And we will strive to avoid adding uncertainty in what is already an extraordinarily challenging and uncertain time. We are highly attentive to inflation risks and determined to take the measures necessary to return inflation to our 2% longer run goal. This process is likely to involve a period of below-trend economic growth.
Vamos a tratar de hacer lo posible para volver a la inflación a de 2%.
Such outcomes are likely
Si
necessary to
la inflación
restore
es muy
price
fuerte, vamos a
stability
subir más. Si baja
and to set the stage
la
for
inflación, obviamente
achieving
menos
maximum
tasas de
employment and
intereses.
stable prices over the longer run.
Está diciendo lo lógico, lo normal.
To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Totalmente normal su presentación. Si sube la inflación, vamos a subir las tasas. Si no, no. Estamos haciendo todo por ustedes, por la gente. Vamos a tratar de que vuelva a 2%.
Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Wondering if you can walk us through your thinking around the decision not to go for a full percentage point increase. We saw a ramp up after the May CPI report came in hotter than usual, and then obviously the June figure did too. Was there any discussion of a stronger hike at this meeting? Yeah, thank you.
¿Por qué no subió 1%?
We did judge that a 75 basis point increase was the right magnitude in light of the data and in the context of the ongoing increases in the policy rate that we've been making. I'd say that we wouldn't hesitate to make an even larger move than we did today if the committee were to conclude that were appropriate. That was not the case at this meeting. There was very broad support for the move that we made. You mentioned the June meeting. We had said many times that we were prepared to move more aggressively if inflation continued to disappoint. And that's why we did move to a more aggressive pace at the June meeting, as we said we would do. At this meeting, we continued at that more aggressive pace as inflation has continued to disappoint in the form of the June CPI reading.
Porque no hemos subido el 1%, porque simplemente no correspondía y ha sido por unanimidad la subida de
Thank you so much for
0.75%.
taking our questions. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. As the committee considers the policy path forward, how will it weigh the expected decline in headline inflation, which might come as a result of the drop in commodity prices, against the fact that we are likely to see some persistence in core readings in particular? And given that potential tension and signs of any kind of activity weakening here, how has the committee's thinking changed on how far into restrictive territory rates might need to go?
So
Extraña su pregunta, pero bueno.
I guess I'd start by saying we've been saying we would move expeditiously to get to the range of neutral, and I think we've done that now. We're at 225 to 2.5, and that's right in the range of what we think is neutral. So the question is, how are we thinking about the path forward? So one thing that hasn't changed is that it won't change is that our focus is going to continue to be on using our tools to bring demand back into better balance with supply in order to bring inflation back down. That'll continue to be our overarching focus. We also said that we expect ongoing rate hikes will be appropriate and that we'll make decisions meeting by meeting. So what are we going to be looking at? We'll be looking at the incoming data, as I mentioned, and that'll start with economic activity. Are we seeing the slowdown in economic activity that we think we need? And there's some evidence that we are at this time. Of course, we'll be looking at labor market conditions, and we'll be asking whether we see the alignment between supply and demand getting better, getting closer. Of course, we'll be looking closely at inflation. You mentioned headline and core. Our mandate is for headline. Of course, it's not for core, but we look at core because core is actually a better indicator of headline and of all inflation going forward. So we'll be looking at both, and we'll be looking at them at those both really for what they're saying about the outlook rather than just simply for what they say. But we'll be asking, do we see inflationary pressures declining? Do we see actual readings of inflation coming down? So in light of all that data, the question we'll be asking is whether the stance of policy we have is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation back down to our 2% target. And it's also worth noting that these rate hikes have been large and they've come quickly, and it's likely that their full effect has not been felt by the economy. So there's probably some significant additional tightening in the pipeline. So where are we going with this? I think the committee broadly feels that we need to get policy at least to a moderately restrictive level. And maybe the best data point for that would be what we wrote down in our SEP at the June meeting. So I think the median for the end of this year, the median would have been between 3.25 and 3.5. And then people wrote down 50 basis points higher than that for 2023. So that's, even though that's now 6 weeks old, I guess, that's the most recent reading. Of course, we'll update that reading at the September meeting in 8 weeks. So that's how we're thinking about it. As I mentioned, as it relates to September, I said that another unusually large increase could be appropriate, but that's not a decision we're making now. It's one that we'll make based on the data we see, and we're going to be making decisions meeting by meeting. We think it's time to just go to a meeting by meeting basis and not provide the kind of clear guidance that we had provided on the way to neutral.
No vamos a dar a futuro predicciones, vamos a hacer reunión por reunión viendo la economía y la inflación básicamente.
Policy works through influencing expectations, and that policy needs to be at least moderately restrictive, which means you need financial conditions to stay tight. Futures market pricing currently implies you will raise rates this year along the lines of your June SEP, but then lower them a few months later next year. Are these expectations consistent with the need to keep financial conditions tight in order to moderate purchasing power and bring inflation back to 2%?
So I'm going to start by pointing out that it's very hard to say with any confidence in normal times, what the economy is going to be doing in 6 or 12 months. And so to try to predict what the appropriate monetary policy response would be, I mean, of course, we do that in the SEP, but nonetheless, you've got to take any estimates of what rates will be next year with a grain of salt, because there's so much uncertainty. These are not normal times. There's significantly more uncertainty now about the path ahead than I think there ordinarily is, and ordinarily it's quite high. So again, I would, the only data point I have for you really is the June SEP, which I think it's just the most recent thing that the committee's done. Since then, inflation has come in higher, economic activity has come in weaker than expected. But at the same time, I would say that
la economía está más débil, la inflación está más alta, por eso hemos subido 0,75. Tampoco está exagerada la situación para subir 1%.
Restrictive level by the end of this year, by which I mean somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, and that the committee sees further rate increases.
Esperemos que este año suba y la siguiente ya suba 3.5% el tema de los intereses.
We'll update that, of course, at the September meeting, but that's
En la
really
reunión de septiembre vamos a hacerlo paso por paso. No nos vamos a adelantar.
Than anticipated. Has your view of the terminal rate changed since June?
Ha cambiado tu pensamiento desde junio.
I think we didn't expect a good reading, but this one was even worse than expected, I would say.
No digas eso. En junio no esperaba que esto fuera a peor, que esto era peor de lo que yo esperaba.
It's going to evolve. It has evolved over the course. I think for all participants, it has evolved over the course of the year as we learn how persistent inflation is going to be. And by the time of the September meeting, we will have seen 2 more CPI readings and 2 more labor market readings, and significant amount of readings about economic activity and perhaps geopolitical developments. Who knows? It'll be a lot. It's an 8-week intermeeting period, so I think we'll see quite a lot of data, and we'll make our decision at that meeting.
Lo mismo, en 8 semanas, en septiembre, vamos a tomar otras decisiones y ver cómo está el tema de la inflación. En esta fue peor de lo que esperaba, pero bueno.
Question, Gina Smile with New York Times. You kind of alluded to this earlier, but I wonder, in the event that you see several months of very weak headline inflation numbers because oil prices are coming down so much, but core inflation continues to be strong or even picks up, I wonder how you would think about that.
So it's hard to deal with.
A pesar de que el petróleo está bajando, porque la inflación sigue siendo alta, ¿cómo ves esa situación, básicamente?
We would look at both, and we'd be asking ourselves, are we confident that inflation is on a path down to 2%? That's really the question. And we'll be making, our policy stance will be set at a level, ultimately, at which we are confident that inflation is going to be moving down to 2%. So it would depend on a lot
Estamos
of
confiando de que la inflación va a bajar a 2%.
Core inflation is a better predictor of inflation going forward. Headline inflation tends to be volatile. So in ordinary times, you look through volatile moves in commodities.
Estás viendo demasiada volatilidad en las materias primas, básicamente, y eso puede o no reflejar la realidad del mercado a corto, mediano plazo.
Or to work on de-anchoring inflation expectations. The public doesn't distinguish between core and headline inflation in their thinking. So it's something we have to take into consideration in our policy making, even though our tools don't really work on some aspects of this, which are the supply side issues.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Thanks for taking my question, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this week, the president said we are not going to be in a recession. So I have 2 questions off of that. Do you share the president's confidence in not being in a recession? And second, how would or would not a recession change policy? Is it a bright line, sir, where contraction of the economy would be a turning point in policy, or is there some amount of contraction of the economy the committee would be willing to abide in its effort to reduce inflation?
Acerca de la recesión que dijo que no existe en Estados Unidos, el presidente
we think it's necessary to have growth slow down. And growth is going to be slowing down this year for a couple of reasons. One of which is that you're coming off of the very high growth of the reopening year of 2021.
El crecimiento no va a ser tan grande este año como
You're also
se espera por el
seeing
hecho de
tighter
que en
monetary
2021 fue
policy, and you
demasiado
should see
fuerte
some
el
slowing. We actually
resurgimiento
think we
desde
need
la
a
pandemia.
period of growth
Era bajo crecimiento este año
below potential in order to create some slack, so
en la
that
economía
the supply
estadounidense,
side can
obviamente.
catch up. We also think that there will be, in all likelihood, some softening in labor market conditions. And those are things that we expect, and we think that they're probably necessary if we were to have, to get inflation, if we were to be able to get inflation back down on a path to 2%, ultimately get there.
Sigue diciendo que esperamos que la inflación baje 2% y estamos trabajando para eso, básicamente. Que no puede decir otra cosa tampoco, ¿no?
So we're going to be focused on getting inflation back down. And we, as I've said on other occasions, price stability is really the bedrock of the economy. And nothing works in the economy without price stability. We can't have a strong labor market without price stability for an extended period of time. We all want to get back to the kind of labor market we had before the pandemic, where differences between racial and gender differences and that kind of thing were at historic minimums, where participation was high, where inflation was low. We want to get back to that, but that's not happening. That's not going to happen without restoring price stability. So that's something we see as something that we simply must do. And we think that we don't see it as a trade-off with the employment mandate. We see it as a way to facilitate the sustained achievement of the employment mandate in the longer term.
Queremos volver a 2019-2018, eso no va a ser posible, por lo
Howard
menos
Schneider with Reuters.
hasta que podamos
Particularly in regard to expectations,
apañar todas
it's been
estas
said the
situaciones
last
que
few
estamos
months that the risks
teniendo.
of doing too little outweighed the risks of doing too much. Does that remain the bias?
So we're trying to do just the right amount, right? We're not trying to have a recession, and we don't think we have to. We think that there's a path for us to be able to bring inflation down while sustaining a strong labor market. As I mentioned, along with, in all likelihood, some softening in labor market conditions. So that's what we're trying to achieve, and we continue to think that there's a path to that. We know that the path has clearly narrowed, really based on events that are outside of our control, and it may narrow further. So, I do think, as I said just now, that restoring price stability is just something that we have to do. There isn't an option to fail to do that, because that is the thing that enables you to have a strong labor market over time. Without restoring price stability, you won't be able to, over the medium and longer term, to actually have a sustained period of very strong labor market conditions. So, of course, we serve both sides of the dual mandate, but we actually see them as well aligned on this.
But as a follow-on to that, given the uncertainty and the sort of paradoxical flow of data you've been getting, if you're going to make a mistake, would you rather make the mistake on doing too much, raising too much, than raising too little?
Yeah, we're trying not to make a mistake. Let me put it this way. We do see
Qué
that there are
ventajista
two-sided
ese
risks. There would be the risk of doing too much
entrevistador.
and imposing more of a downturn on the economy than was necessary. But the risk of doing too little
Es que dijo,
and
si nos
leaving the
equivocamos,
economy with this entrenched
vamos a tratar
inflation,
de
it only raises the
recuperarnos,
cost.
etcétera,
If
y
we fail to deal with it in the near term, it only raises the cost of dealing with it later. To the extent people start to see it as just part of their economic lives, they start to factor high inflation into their decisions, when that, on a sustained basis, when that starts to really happen, and we don't think that's happened yet, but when that starts to happen, it just gets that much harder, and the pain will be that much greater. So I really do think that it's important that we address this now and get it done.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin from Axios. To build a little bit on what Steve was asking, do you believe the United States is currently in a recession? Will the GDP reading tomorrow affect that judgment one way or the other? And has your assessment of the risk of recession changed any in recent weeks?
¿Mismo crees que estamos en una recesión? No. Siguiente
I do
pregunta.
not think the U.S. is currently in a recession.
Lo mismo. ¿Por qué no preguntan
And the
otra cosa
reason is
increíble?
There's too many areas of the economy that are performing, too well. And of course, I would point to the labor market in particular. As I mentioned, it's true that growth is slowing, and for reasons that we understand. Really, the growth was extraordinarily high last year, 5.5%. we would have expected growth to slow. There's also more slowing going on now. But if you look at the labor market, you've got growth, I think payroll jobs averaging 450,000 per month. That's a remarkably strong level for this state of affairs. The unemployment rate at near a 50-year low at 3.6%. All of the wage measures that we track are running very strong. So this is a very strong labor market.
El mercado laboral todavía se mantiene fuerte, o sea que no hay recesión, esperan que unos $1.500 para un empleo está relativamente bien. No tiene sentido decir que estamos en una recesión. No creo que estemos en una recesión. Y como dice, vamos a bajar la inflación al 2% y vamos a subir las tasas de interés. Si es que...
I mean, I would say generally the GDP numbers do have a tendency to be revised pretty significantly. It's very hard to accumulate U.S. GDP. It's a large economy, and a lot of work and judgment goes into that. But you tend to take first GDP reports, I think, with a grain of salt. But of course, it's something we'll be looking at.
Hi, Chair Powell. Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to ask about the new conflict of interest rules that you all rolled out. Some senators have written asking for those rules to have more teeth and to have sort of more transparency about the Fed officials' financial activity. I was wondering if you could speak to that and whether you intend on toughening those rules in any way.
So those are the toughest rules in place, at any comparable institution that I'm aware of. We think, we thought about this carefully, and we put them in place, and we're building the infrastructure so that the enforcement will be tight, that actually you won't be able to make trades unless they're pre-cleared, and the amount of trades you make will be, they'll have to be 45 days or more before any FOMC meeting. It's just, I think we've really, created a very strong and robust set of rules.
Hablando de las reglas que existen en la Reserva Federal, lo cual no tiene sentido, es decir, si inviertes o no inviertes, tiene cierto ventajismo, filtrada de información para beneficios de terceros. O sea,
Hi, Katarina Saraiva, Bloomberg News. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the 75 basis points versus 50 versus 25. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of goes into your thinking for, making the decision on how much to raise rates, and, just talking about a very large amount that you alluded to, could that possibly be 100 basis points? And then kind of along those lines, is there any sort of weakness in the economy outside of inflation measures that would lead you to slow your hiking pace?
¿De qué va a depender que suba 1%, básicamente?
I'm gonna take that as a question about the next meeting and thereafter. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at all of those things: activity, labor market, inflation, and we're going to be thinking about our policy stance and where does it really need to be. And I also mentioned that as this process, now that we're at neutral, as the process goes on, at some point, it will be appropriate to slow down. And we haven't made a decision when that point is, but intuitively that makes sense, right? We've been front-end loading these very large rate increases, and now we're getting closer to where we need to be. So that's how we're thinking about it. And we're, in terms of September, we're going to watch the data and the
básicamente, déjame esa pregunta para septiembre, la voy a dejar para que la responda ahí. No tiene sentido decirte en qué se basa. Vamos a ver el mercado laboral, la economía, la inflación.
But I mentioned that we might do another unusually large rate increase, but that's not a decision that we've made at all. So we are, we're
He dejado la puerta abierta, pero no es una decisión ya tomada.
I think you can still think of the destination as broadly in line with the June SEP, because it's only 6 weeks old, and sometimes SEPs can get old really quick. I think in this one I would say is probably the best guide we have as to where the committee thinks it needs to get at the end of the year and then into next year. So,
¿dónde tiene que llegar el precio de las materias primas para que podamos resurgir de todo esto y podamos tener una mejor economía en 2023?
Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. I wanted to ask about, right now there is a sort of growing gap between the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, the PCE index, and the one that's followed by the public, the CPI, of course. How do you expect to handle this divergence if the PCE starts to come down enough for you to consider slowing rate hikes, even if the public is still seeing much higher CPI ratings? Thank you.
So it's an interesting situation. Of course, we've long used PCE because we think it's just better at capturing the inflation that people actually face in their lives.
Precio
And
al
I think
consumidor.
that view is pretty widely understood. That said, the public really reads about CPI. And the difference really is because the CPI has higher weights on things like food, gasoline, motor vehicles, and housing than the
Subida el
PCE
precio de
index
las
does.
casas,
And so that
gasolina,
accounts for a lot of
obviamente
the
todo
difference.
sube, los
However,
alimentos.
over time, they tend to come together. You know, we were given the importance in the public eye of CPI, we are calling it out and noticing it and everything like that. But remember, we do target PCE. That is because we think it's a better measure. They will come together eventually. The typical gap was really about 25 basis points for a very long time. And if it got to, 40 basis points, that would be very noticeable. Now it's much larger than that because of the things I mentioned. So
Por las
we'll be
cosas que
watching both
mencionamos,
and,
ir subiendo de
but again,
25
the
a
one that we think is the
50,
best
75,
measure always
posiblemente
has been PCE. At least since,
1%.
I think we, some 20 plus years ago, moved to PCE.
Luz María.
I'd like to weave a couple of things together, Mr. Chairman. Michael McKee from Bloomberg TV and Radio. You said that the destination pretty much remains the same in terms of your end of the year target, but where are you in the journey? We've now seen the federal stimulus programs end. You mentioned consumer spending, business investment have slowed. Are they moving at a pace you would expect, or is demand still greater than supply, too much greater than supply, that you need to do significantly more? And I ask because there are lags in the impact of monetary policy, as you mentioned, and a lot of this might hit in 2023. The strong dollar effect may hit in 2023 when the economy might be weak. How do you know where you are and where you think you need to get to?
Well, just talking about demand for a second, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think you pretty clearly do see a slowing now in demand in the second quarter. Consumer spending, business fixed investment, housing, places like that. I think, people widely looked at the first quarter numbers and thought they didn't make sense and might have been misleading in terms of the overall direction of the economy. Not true of the second quarter. But at the same time, you have this labor market. So there are plenty of experiences where GDP has been reported as weak and the labor market is strong and the economy has gone right through that and been fine. So that's happened many times. And it used to happen, if you remember, in the first quarter of every year for several years in a row, GDP was negative and the labor market was moving along just fine, and it turned out to just be measurement error. It was called residual seasonality. We don't know the situation. The truth is, though, we think that demand is moderating. We do. How much is it moderating? We're not sure. We're going to have to watch the data carefully. There is a great deal of money on people's balance sheets that they can spend. The unemployment rate is very low. The labor market's very hot. There are many, many job openings. Wages are high. So it's the kind of thing where you think that the economy should actually be doing pretty well in the second half of the year. But we'll have to see. We don't know that because you do see a marked slowing in the second quarter that is fairly broad. So we'll be watching that. We'll be watching that. Of course, as I mentioned, we do want to see demand running below potential for a sustained period to create slack and give inflation a chance to come down.
Hi, thank you, Chairman. Nicole Goodkind, CNN Business. When does the committee expect to see a meaningful slowdown in the labor market, and how much weakness will it accept with regard to slower job growth and higher unemployment before it pauses or begins to think about cutting rates?
So I think you're already you've seen in the labor market, what you've seen is a decline from very high levels of job creation last year and earlier this year to modestly slower job creation. Still quite robust, as I mentioned. So you're seeing that. You're seeing some increase in initial claims for uninsurance, although that may actually have to do with seasonal adjustments. We're not sure that that's actually real. There's some evidence that wages, if you look at average hourly earnings, they appear to be moderating. not so yet from the other wage measures, and we'll be getting the Employment Compensation Index measurement, I think, on Friday, I guess. And that's a very important one because it adjusts for composition. So I'd say you and also anecdotally, you hear much, the sort of level of concern on the part of businesses that they simply can't find workers is probably down a little bit from what it was, say, for example, late in the latter parts of last year. So there's a feeling that the labor market is moving back into balance. If you look at job openings or quits, you see them moving sideways or perhaps a little bit down. But it's
La
only
cantidad
the
de
beginning
empleos
of
que se han
an adjustment.
abierto,
But I think
tienes que fijarte eso
most,
también para...
also, if you look at, I mean, once you start citing these things, you can't stop. If you look at the household survey, you see much lower job creation, and the household survey can be quite volatile, but it has no jobs created in the last 3 months. So that might be a signal that job creation is actually a little bit slower than we're seeing in the establishment survey. So executive summary, I would say there's some evidence that labor demand may be slowing a bit. Labor supply, not so much.
Yeah.
We've been disappointed that labor force participation really hasn't moved up since January. That may be related to yet another big wave of COVID, and there's evidence that that's the case. But so we're not seeing much in the way of labor supply. Nonetheless, I would say some progress on demand and supply getting back in alignment. So I think we're going to be looking at inflation as well. We you know, as I mentioned, we need to see inflation coming down. We need to be confident that inflation is going to get back down to mandate consistent levels. That's not something we can avoid doing. That really needs to happen. But we do think, though, that the labor market can adjust because of the huge overhang of job openings, of excess demand, really. There should be able to be an adjustment that would have perhaps lower than expected increases in unemployment, lower than would be expected in the ordinary course of events, because the ratio of vacancies to unemployed is just out of keeping with historical experience, and that suggests that this time could be different.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence from Fox Business. So you said the path
Que
may
no está
be
diciendo nada
narrowed,
fuera de lo
to
normal, está
avoiding
diciendo, está
recession.
hablando
So
acerca del mercado
how close
laboral.
are we to a recession? And then how do forecasts of possible recessions from banks and economists, how does that make a soft landing you've talked about more difficult?
So as I mentioned, it doesn't seem that the U.S. economy is in recession right now. And I think you do see weakening, some slowdown, let's put it that way, in growth, and you see it across some of the categories that I mentioned. But
Algunas categorías simplemente están bajando de crecimiento, no vemos recesión en Estados Unidos.
So overall, you would say that in all probability, demand is still strong, and the economy is still on track to continue to grow this year. But the slowdown in the second quarter is notable, and we're going to be watching that carefully. Sorry, what was a lot?
Forecasts. How did bank forecast possible recessions comes? Does that affect the soft landing?
Well, we've said since the beginning, I think, that having a soft landing is what we're aiming for. Of course, that has to be our goal. It is our goal, and we'll keep trying to achieve it. I do think events. At the beginning, we said it was not going to be easy. It was going to be quite challenging to do that. It's unusual. It's an unusual event. It's not a typical event, given where we are. If there is a path to it, and we think there is, it is the one I mentioned, that the labor market actually has such a large amount of surplus demand that you could see that demand coming down in a way that didn't translate into a big increase in unemployment, as you would expect in the ordinary course, because frankly the imbalance is so much greater. But we don't know that. I mean, this is a case of first impression. So anyone who is really sure that it's impossible or really sure that it will happen is probably underestimating the level of uncertainty. And so I would certainly say it's an uncertain thing. Nonetheless, it's our goal to
No
achieve
puede
it,
hablar
and
con
we'll keep trying to do
total
that.
certeza de lo que puede pasar o no. Dependemos de muchas cosas, básicamente. y depende de la data que vaya a surgir dentro de un par de semanas, pues de 8 semanas específicamente, vamos a ver el tema de si sube 1%, que lo ha puesto como una posibilidad.
What are you learning about how it's working and how markets are reacting? And is reaching the minimum level of reserves needed in the system still several years away at the current pace?
So we think it's working fine. As you know, we tapered up into it, and in September we'll go to a full strength, and the markets seem to have accepted it. By all assessments, the markets should be able to absorb this, and we expect that'll be the case. So I would say the plan is broadly on track. It's a little bit slow to get going because some of these trades don't settle until for a bit of time, but it'll be picking up steam.
Déjenme poner mi contraseña, se va a bloquear esto de un segundo, por favor.
The process of getting back down to the new equilibrium will take a while, and that time, it's hard to be precise, but the model would suggest that it could be between 2.5 years, that kind of thing.
2 años y medio para un equilibrio total.
Than the last time. Balance sheet's much bigger than it was, but we looked at this carefully and we thought that this was a sensible pace, and we have no reason to think it's not.
Bastante interesante.
Hi, Chairman Powell. Brian Chung, Yahoo Finance.
2 segundos, por favor.
Looking at financial conditions, it seems like
Voy
the
a poner mi
tightening has
contraseña.
slowed as of late with the 10-year coming down, 30-year fixed mortgage rates also going a bit sideways when we talk about a hot housing market still. Just wondering if you find financial conditions tight enough, especially as you continue to raise rates.
So a big piece of that is inflation expectations, break-evens coming down, which is a good thing. It's a good thing that markets do seem to have confidence in the committee's commitment to getting inflation back down to 2%. So we like to see market-based, readings of inflation expectations come in. Broader financial conditions have tightened a good bit. I mean, the way this works is we set our policy, and financial conditions react, and then financial conditions are what affects the economy. So, and we don't control that second step. We're just going to do what we think needs to be done. We're going to get our policy rate to a level where we're confident that inflation will be moving back down to 2%.
Lo mismo, es decir, los aspectos de la economía que no podemos controlar, aunque seamos la Reserva Federal, dependemos de ellas también para poder apañar este tipo de situaciones. Estoy esperando a que diga algo súper negativo para ver si el mercado se da la vuelta, básicamente.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Greg Robb from MarketWatch. I wonder if you can go back a little bit in time to before there was this outbreak of inflation, when the committee put in place forward guidance on tapering asset purchases. I think it was December 2020. There's a recent speech by Fed Governor Waller talking about that and saying that maybe that was too tight, that kind of condition.
Hablando de 2020, cuando todo estaba básicamente por la inflación, se venía por el tema de la impresión de billetes, la pandemia, etcétera.
To some of that inflation. So could you talk about that decision, and have you looked at it in hindsight at all? Thank you.
So, yeah, we said that we wouldn't lift off until we had basically achieved our dual mandate goals. And the reason we did it in real time was that
Si me pasas el enlace, querida Janet, podemos irnos al video si lo tienes en español. Más que todo para... Me gusta verlo.
Some of our critics now who say inflation is too high were the same ones who were saying you'll never get to 2%. Well, but anyway, that's what happened. So we thought we needed to really make a strong statement with that. It wasn't part of the framework. The December 20 guidance was not part of our overall new framework. It was just guidance that we put in place. So I would say 2 things. One, I don't think that has materially changed the situation, but I have to admit, I don't think I would do that again. I don't think I would do that again. We, ultimately the situation evolved in a highly unexpected way for all of us, and maybe the learning is that leave a little more flexibility than that. But did it matter in the end? If you look at, I really don't think it did. I'm not sure it would have mattered if we'd been raising rates 3 months earlier. Does anybody think that would have made a big difference? I mean, lots of central banks were raising rates 3 months earlier, and it didn't matter.
No hubiera habido una real bajada de inflación si hubiéramos incrementado el tipo de interés en diciembre de 2020 antes de que surja absolutamente todo. No creo que haya sido el causante una poca reacción de la Fed para
a lot of
la
people talk
inflación
about
tan
that
alta.
time and they talk about a taper tantrum that I know you haven't talked about it too much, but that you were worried at the time about repeating that taper tantrum that you had experienced.
Sí, Janet, si lo pillas, si estás con el link del video en español, también podemos ir ahí si gustan, no hay problema.
There have been multiple taper tantrums, right? So there was the famous one in 2013. There's what happened at the December 18 meeting where markets can ignore developments around the balance sheet for years on end and then suddenly react very sharply. So we just had developed a practice of moving predictably and doing it in steps and things like that. It was just like that's how we did it. And so we did it that way this time. We were careful to take steps and
Estábamos en 2020, ahora estamos en 2013.
Yeah, we were trying to avoid a tantrum because they can be quite destructive. They can tighten financial conditions and knock the economy off kilter. And when it happens, you have to really in both 13 and 18 really had consequences for the real economy. 2, 3, 4 months later. So we were trying to avoid that. That was part of it. Again, I don't think that's the real issue of 2020 and 21 was just trying to understand what was happening with the reopening economy. That was where the big uncertainty was. And our view was that these supply side issues would get better, that people would go back to work, that labor force participation would come back, everyone would get vaccinated, schools would open, kids would be in school, and labor force participation would jump back up. That was very broadly thought to be the case. These supply side issues would get solved reasonably quickly, and they just haven't. They still haven't. So that's really the learning, I think, is around how complicated these supply side issues can be. We haven't seen this before in a long, long time, and so that's really what accounts for the pace at which we moved. And we did. When inflation changed direction really in October, we've moved quickly since then. I think people would agree.
Es decir, se está defendiendo de que la Reserva Federal no actuó muy rápidamente. 2020, 2021, pues estaban en una reapertura de la pandemia, no sabían qué era lo que iba a pasar, esperaban que todos iban a volver a trabajar y todo iba a ser como antes. Se vino la guerra y estamos en una situación bastante complicada que no se veía hace mucho, así que básicamente está defendiendo las decisiones que ha tomado la Fed.
Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. Chair Powell, I just want to pin you down a little bit more on the issue of recession. So if we get a negative GDP number tomorrow for the second quarter, would the Fed consider the U.S. in a recession? And just remind us
Reporte del PIB y mañana también tenemos el reporte de la Fed acerca de la actividad económica. Dos reportes negativos del crecimiento puede ser una recesión y está diciendo, ¿ella lo consideraría una recesión o no?
We don't say there is now a recession, that kind of thing. So that wouldn't be something we do. We would look at the data tomorrow, and no doubt we'll look at it very carefully and draw whatever implications we can. As I mentioned, though, if you think about what a recession really is, it's a broad-based decline across many industries that that sustain for more than a couple of months, and there are a bunch of specific tests in it, and it just doesn't seem like that now. What we have right now doesn't seem like that, and the real reason is that the labor market is just sending such a signal of economic strength that it makes you really question the GDP data. But again, that's not a decision that we make, and we won't reach a conclusion one way or another on that.
Que está diciendo que el reporte de mañana va a ser un poco
Thank you very much,
confuso
Simon
porque
Rubich
la
with
economía
The
está fuerte.
Economist. You said that some softening in the
Okay.
labor market is
Puede ser un poco
needed.
engañoso el reporte de
Within
mañana.
the Fed, there are staff economists who've argued that NIRU, the non-inflationary rate of unemployment, might be as high as 5 to 6% right now, which obviously is a lot higher than the current rate of 3.6. What's your assessment of NIRU? Is that something that came up in discussion with the committee?
So I think broadly, a lot of economists think that the natural rate of unemployment will have moved up to some significant extent above where we think it was before. And the reason is it's the usual matching issue where matching has become less effective and that kind of thing when you have the kind of turbulent downturn and the big switches in demand from services to goods and all that. So It could be higher, and my own instinct is that the natural rate of unemployment is higher. Of course, I would add that we don't know it. We can never know where these star variables are in real time with any
El
confidence.
desempleo está un
But I
poco
would say
más
it must have
alto.
moved up materially.
Eso es lo real.
But the other side of that is, as as all these jobs get created and people go back to work and unemployment is so low, I think you could, in principle, you could see it coming back down pretty significantly. And that would also, by the way, take pressure off of inflation, because it's that gap. It's the gap between actual unemployment and the natural rate that really is relevant for, the negative slack we have in the economy by the overtight labor market. So if you were to, you wouldn't observe this. It's an unobservable, but you could actually be seeing inflationary pressures coming down if that does happen. And we don't control that, but that's something that logically, if the pandemic and the disorder in the labor market cause the natural rate to move up, then as the labor market settles down, in principle, you should see it move back down.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jeff Cox from CNBC.com. Just a question about, I hate to keep banging the drum about recession, but most of the polls that we're seeing now from the public, people believe that we're already in a recession or heading for one. Economists pretty much the same thing. They're being told by folks like you and in the administration that we're not in a recession, we're not heading for a recession. Frankly, coming from the same people who told them that inflation was transitory, telling them now that we're not heading for a recession. So what would you tell the public to reassure them now that you feel confident in your forecast going forward and the Fed is
¿Qué
ready
le
to
dirías a la
respond
población para que confíe de que no estamos en una
potential
recesión?
downturn in the economy?
All I've really said is I don't think it's likely that the U.S. economy is in a recession now, and I've explained why that is the case. It's because you do see a very strong labor market, and I think the public will see that as well. Going forward, what we've seen is a slowing in spending, as I
Con un
mentioned.
mercado laboral
We've seen the very
fuerte, estamos
beginnings
viendo
of
que no estamos
perhaps
creciendo
a
al
slight
mismo ritmo que años anteriores.
lessening in-
Eso es lo que
in-
está viendo la
in
gente
the,
y como está tan
tightness of the
acostumbrada a
labor
crecer
market,
tan
but
fuerte,
it would only
especialmente en
be the
2020,
beginnings.
pues dice que está,
So, and I mentioned that I also
que
said
está pensando que
that,
está en una recesión.
our goal is to
Es
bring
lo que tiene que
inflation
decir.
down and have a so-called soft landing, by which I mean a landing that doesn't require a significant increase, a really significant increase in unemployment. We're trying to achieve that. I've said on many occasions that we understand that's going to be quite challenging and that it's gotten more challenging over recent months.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Kyle Campbell with American Banker. The FOMC has historically tried to avoid the kind of rapid monetary policy tightening that has happened so far this year. How concerned are you that the rate hikes that we've seen thus far might increase risks to financial stability, not just domestically, but globally?
Esta es la última pregunta que vamos a ver y vamos a estar en vivo después para los resultados de Facebook, ¿sí?
1994, 1980, even more so.
Ya estamos más de casi una hora
We've been known to do that when it's
escuchando a
the
Jerome
appropriate
Powell.
thing to do, and this year it clearly is. I would say that given how quickly we've moved, I'm gratified that that basically markets have been working, they've been orderly. There's been some volatility, but that's only to be expected. From a financial stability perspective, asset values are down, which in some sense lowers vulnerabilities. It's when they're really high that you would worry that they're vulnerable to a fall. Actually, many asset values have come down. I think you've got a well-capitalized banking system. I think you have households are generally in about as strong financial shape as they've been in a very long time, or perhaps ever, given what the money that's on people's balance sheets, and so you have from a financial stability standpoint, you have a pretty decent picture. Now, there are plenty of macroeconomic issues that don't rise to the level of financial stability concerns. By financial stability, we think of that as things that might undermine the working of the financial system, so big, serious things. That's not to say that people at the lower end of the income spectrum aren't suffering, because they are. They're suffering from high inflation. They're going to to the grocery store and finding that in many cases their paycheck, it doesn't cover the food they're accustomed to buying. We're seeing actual, real declines in food consumption, and it's very concerning. It's very unfortunate, and that's why we're really committed to bringing down inflation.
Está diciendo que es normal la volatilidad en los mercados de valores y que básicamente no quiere apañar el tema de la inflación, simplemente
Thank you,
paciencia y
Chairman
apoyo.
Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. I can remember
Para
when you held your first
la
news
Fed,
conference
básicamente.
and you vowed to be a very plain-spoken chairman, and we're thinking today about the impacts of Fed policy on individuals as well. What would you say to individuals or households who may yet lose their jobs in this type?
Lo vamos a dejar hasta aquí el directo, por favor. Vamos a estar en directo a partir de, media hora, con los resultados de Facebook, con los resultados de Facebook. De hecho, a ver, vamos a revisar eso. Quiero verlo de 2 segundos. Va a reportar luego los resultados. Meta Platforms, Facebook, Ford, Qualcomm, Teladoc. Vamos a estar en vivo para eso también. Y vamos a estar en vivo aproximadamente en media hora revisando esto. Revisando cómo va el mercado de valores. A ver. Subiendo. Básicamente no ha pasado absolutamente nada. Visa ya subiendo. De hecho, estaba cayendo bastante. Está subiendo por el tema de justamente este artículo donde está de la subida de tasas de las tarjetas de crédito, que la Reserva Federal levantando las tasas, es probable que la tasa de porcentaje anual de tu tarjeta se incremente y es por eso que Visa cayó, pero con el reporte de Jerome Powell, pues básicamente nos fuimos para arriba, todo está tranquilo, el Nasdaq está subiendo 4%, el S&P también, PayPal seguramente en 10% ya, sí 12%, el mercado se ha ido para arriba, Visa ya subió un poco, el S&P 500, todo está subiendo de hecho. Vamos a actualizar estos 2 segundos. Perfecto. Wow. 5% en Amazon, casi 4% en el Nasdaq, Apple en 3, Tesla en 6, 8 en Alphabet, Microsoft en 6, 6 en Meta Platforms, Nvidia en 7. Como tengan buenos resultados, especialmente Meta Platforms, nos vamos a ir para arriba de manera increíble. El S&P 500 y el Nasdaq ya seguramente han roto tendencias bajistas. Vamos a revisar ambos, pues son los más importantes el día de hoy. ¿Cómo está el tema de dividendos? Coca-Cola cayendo, a ver, Coca-Cola en 0.30, ya está pasando el tema. Tengan cuidado con el salto del gato muerto, por favor, no se emocionen por completo. Todo está a un interesante precio aún, pero yo creo que es importante tener en cuenta esto. Mira, tendencia bajista en el S&P 500, ya la ha roto, ha confirmado su rompimiento de tendencia bajista en el S&P 500. En el Nasdaq 100 está en techo todavía, así que hay que tener bastante cuidado ahí. Puede rebotar, tenemos que tener cuidado ahí. Vamos a ver cómo están los reportes trimestrales de Facebook una vez que cierre el mercado. Las criptomonedas también dando un salto de 15% de Ethereum, de aproximadamente 10% el tema del Bitcoin. Las de alto riesgo también todas en positivo. Todo está subiendo absolutamente todo. En Carnival 3%, simplemente JP Morgan subiendo, Visa lateral, bueno, cayendo un poco ya. PayPal en 12, ¿cuál más? Intel en 3, Nvidia en 7. Bastante importante la subida del mercado del día de hoy, afortunadamente. Vamos a revisar y vamos a estar en vivo para eso, ¿sí? Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí conmigo en vivo en la Reserva Federal. Estamos con un nuevo, ¿crees que suba en un punto? Sí, yo creo que sí va a subir. Dice Janet Rincón, ¿cómo estás, Janet? De acuerdo, muchas gracias. Sí, el mitoño volador nos dice el mercado en verde, efectivamente. ¿Por qué la subida también del euro dólar? Lo vamos a revisar en un momento, por favor, doctor. Ludwig, ¿cómo estás? Johnson, Club de Fans. Qué divertido tu nombre. Luz María, un beso, gracias a ti por estar aquí. Muldes, aún no sacan el balance del segundo trimestre de la economía gringa. O ya hicieron y anunciaron oficialmente que están en recesión. No, de hecho, todo lo contrario, por eso el mercado de valores está subiendo, se escucha bien de data, muchas gracias. Alexis nos dice que la tasa de interés subirá 2 puntos de aquí a diciembre, ¿sabes algo? Sí, de hecho están diciendo que un punto porcentual puede estar, entre comillas, a favor la Fed dentro de los reportes que vaya a haber con el tema del crecimiento económico. ¿Crees que sube un punto? Ya subió 0.75, querido. Ernesto, sí. Y Janet, ¿cómo estás? Inversión de noticias en español. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí en vivo. Gracias, Janet. Gracias a todos por estar conmigo aquí en el chat en directo, en el chat destacado también. Interesante. Esta es una nueva forma de ver para que también tengan un poco de exposición y me parece bastante interesante. Ahí, Janet, gracias. De acuerdo, Luis. Muchas gracias. Nos vemos en la tarde, en media hora, para el reporte de Facebook de Qualcomm y ver cómo sigue el mercado de valores y darle una Luis, ¿verificas Meta? Mil gracias. Claro que sí, ahora lo verifico. ¿Cómo está Meta actualmente? Vamos a tener el reporte trimestral, así que no te preocupes. 7% arriba, 170. Bastante interesante. Ojalá que reporte buenos resultados y no nos amargue el día. El S&P 3%, Nasdaq 4%. Se puede decir un rally alcista bastante importante. Así que nos vemos en la tarde en aproximadamente una media horita para ver los reportes de Facebook. ¿Sí? Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Nos vemos en media horita. Adiós, adiós, adiós. Adiós.